Well, welcome everyone to a live interview. We've got Slater Weinstock in the hot seat. Slater is a graduate of Washington State University, got his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry in 2015, and then went on to get a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science in 2019. So he has been working as an engineer, a security engineer at Casaba, as Bernie mentioned, since January of 2020. And Casaba has operations in Singapore, and I will, the caveat is he's just off a plane from Singapore, so he's a few time zones off, but he informs me he will be coherent. So he works around he reviews iOS and Mac OS application security in his job and lower level code bases in C and C++. He started out doing web application security, and he still does that on occasion and does cryptographic reviews, which involve ensuring the appropriate cryptographic primitives are being used in the right context. So that's just a little bit of background on Slater. We're going to learn a lot more about him and his day-to-day life, what it's like to be a cybersecurity professional. So without further ado, let's give a round of applause to Slater Weinstock. All right.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So what, Slater, drew you into the cybersecurity profession?
So to be forthright, right? Like graduation, I had a number of offers from companies, and the offer from Casaba came in. Pretty much the owner called me and was like, dude, you want to take us. Like, you know you like this. So what drew me to getting involved in cyber was really just, I hate to say good vibes, but good vibes with individuals who I interviewed with. Because, I mean, you know, I had software engineering opportunities and a number of others, so I didn't really know where I wanted it. Now, right after starting was like, yeah, this is going on. I'm still with the company, and why am I still interested in that type of stuff? And I guess what also drew me into it, in fact, what I saw in the interview was kind of bad. It's a great pickup line to be like, hey, I'm a hacker. What do you do? Like, oh, and people are like, wow, that's really cool. But cybersecurity, it's a huge field. There's a lot of different aspects, a lot of different languages, a lot of different tech stacks that you have to know. You have to know it intimately enough that you can break into a system. You have to understand the software development process and software engineering process. You have to know how to violate developer assumptions. It's a puzzle, so that's kind of fun. I mean, our typical engagements are 4 to 6 weeks. We'll talk a little bit later about that. So I have to become an expert in the system. It's fun to play the criminal to an extent. And honestly, the job prospects, which we'll also get to, look really good. You know, to be transparent, obviously, there's been a lot of layoffs in the computer science and software field. Cybersecurity has been fairly resilient to that, mainly because if you're a big company and you get hacked, goodbye customers, right? I mean, you violate customers' trust, you may not get that back for a very long time. Also, you may spend millions and millions and millions of dollars trying to recover from that. So to boil it down, job prospects, job security, the funness of the field, playing the criminal, playing the bad guy, all of those kind of kept me in the field, drew me into the field, seemed fun. Yeah.
Great. I want to dig into what it's like to be Slater on the job, but to provide some backdrop for that, could you just talk about your company and what it does, and kind of situate your work within the company?
Sure. So Cybersecurity, we're known as kind of like the IoT and cloud security provider, but we're a cybersecurity consultancy firm. We have been around since 2002, and we work with a lot of really big name companies. So we are the lead security auditors of record of Microsoft Azure, Microsoft Teams, Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp Business. So a number of products that are used by billions and billions and billions of people on a day-to-day basis. I mean, obviously these applications have a huge blast radius if they're compromised. So the fact that we get to work on those applications is really exciting. We cover the full spectrum of cybersecurity. So we do mobile, application security, that's primarily what I focus on. We also have Android people who focus more on the Android application side of things. We have web application security engineers. We have cloud engineers. So pretty much the full spectrum. We actually have the principal cryptographer from Microsoft's cryptographic review board on staff, and he helps out with a lot of the cryptography implementations. So from a high level, that's what Cassava Security does. So I started out in web application security, primarily because when you're first getting started, it can be very overwhelming. Back in the 90s, you could be an expert in cybersecurity. Nowadays, you can be an expert in a particular area of cybersecurity. So Portswigger Web Security Academy has a great resource called Web Security Academy, which helps you with understanding web security. So that's primarily why I started with web application security. And I moved into the mobile operating systems because really I like it. I started developing in Swift early on, so I enjoyed mobile application development. And my boss at the time was like, hey, do you want to hop over into mobile applications? I'm like, yeah, you know what? Sure. So day-to-day life pretty much is, so let's go into engagement. So a typical engagement, so a pen testing engagement, cybersecurity engagement with a company typically involves a scoping call where we'll have a call, we'll discuss the application, we'll understand the technical requirements of this application. So that may mean anything from, okay, what are you looking for from this black box, white box approach to that? Black box meaning we have no knowledge, so we just use a production client and we just attack the crap out of it and try to figure out how a hacker would do that. And then the white box approach where we have full access to everything. So what we call that type of review is a gray box methodology. So we utilize sort of that reconnaissance from the black box approach, so not knowing anything about the application, while also being like, hey, we saw this functionality, let's go look at the code, let's drive that to understand more about what the application's doing, then go back out and kind of go back and forth between those. So that'll be the initial scoping call. Then we'll go into the project engagement, which is traditionally 4 to 6 weeks. And it'll involve a number of conversations with engineers. Remember, we have 4 to 6 weeks to become experts in the product. You can imagine that some of the applications I mentioned are millions and millions and millions of lines of code. So we do meet with engineers. We do kind of discuss the application. What are their concerns? What are their worries? Are there particular code pointers that maybe haven't gotten enough review in the past? And I do want to emphasize that security is an iterative process. So if we review the application, we will go back and look at what we kind of looked at last time, validate some things there, maybe go into some new functionality. And from there, we start hitting the application. So I have a number of whiteboards in my office. Pretty much I draw up architecture diagrams. I start looking at the code base. I start seeing how the engineers and how the teams working on the application design things, what kind of coding patterns did they use? Can I start to get an understanding of where app developers may have made assumptions? So in the case of like a phone number field, classic developer assumption would be, okay, people are only going to insert phone numbers here. I mean, that's a really, really simple example. So maybe they're not expecting A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So what happens if I insert A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Does it crash the application? Is there no process to handle it? Are they doing client-side validation? Are they doing server-side validation? Now, for a number of applications, we'll just go through those simple test cases just to validate things. Then we'll start going into the deeper stuff. And the deeper stuff is things like, let's say you're reviewing an audio video application. How do they handle simulcasting? How do they handle multicasting? Are they using WebRTC? If they are using WebRTC, how are state machines handled? I do a number of state machine validation reviews. So state machines are a huge area where you can get a lot of violations of that. A classic example of a state machine hack is Signal in their WebRTC implementation in 2019. They didn't do callee validation. So callee caller validation. So effectively, I could call you and I could send a P2P connect signal and it would answer on your behalf, even though you never answered the phone. Now, a listening device, imagine Signal end-to-end encryption is used by a number of people. So that's an example. So we'll start going into those deeper test cases. We'll look at the code, we'll review the code. Obviously, we can't review millions of lines of code. Doesn't matter how many engineers you have looking at the application, that's not possible. not in 4 to 6 weeks. So you may use tools like Sneak, which is a software composition analysis tool. You may use tools like SemGrep, MobSF. You may, if they have cloud infrastructure, use tools like Scout Suite, and start kind of validating certain components of the code base. You may look for dangerous APIs. So classically in React, for example, if you see dangerously set enter HTML, that's a dangerous method. I love how React names it dangerously. But you may look at that and try to find those types of things and see where in the code they're using it. Why are they using it? Is there a reason? Maybe they're using a rich text editor. Is there not? And then I'll start just playing with the application kind of like from a user perspective. So, you know, if I download this application, how would I start registering? That type of stuff. So it's a mixture of a game. It's a mixture of trying to just play with it and see what happens, and a mixture of more of the software development process and the engineering process.
It sounds like a rich mix of creativity, gamesmanship, you know, technical architecture, understanding of architecture. You're bringing to bear a broad spectrum of skills. And one of the skills that you alluded to but that I think is probably underestimated in cybersecurity is like communication and you know, really communicating with the client to understand you know, the constraints of the application and requirements. So how does it, could you talk a little bit more about what role communication plays?
So communications, and you'll find that across all engineering disciplines. So if you're a software developer, you're going to be writing spec documents. You're going to be talking to business-facing individuals who have no technical background. You have to explain things. From a cybersecurity perspective, I may be talking with the CISO of companies, so they may not have done cybersecurity in a long time. They may be focused more on the business side of security. I may be speaking to CTOs. I may be speaking to lead developers. I may be speaking to regular engineers. I may be speaking to project managers, technical PMs, program managers. I may be speaking to someone who is just like, hey, can this wait? Can this not wait? Maybe they're just trying to drive how long fixes take and stuff. So there's a large spectrum of people you'll speak with in engineering. From a communication standpoint, when we're starting an engagement, you have to understand how to ask questions. Now, I know that sounds pretty obvious, but one thing that I learned, don't send an email where you're asking 10 questions because you'll only get an answer to 1 or 2, and then the rest of them will all be ignored. So understanding that, be very targeted. If you have a concern about features, send screenshots about that feature. If there's something you are seeing, describe what you are seeing, capture a video if you don't know what to describe. Don't delay. If you're not sure you're looking at the right thing, for example, don't sit there and wait 2 weeks to try to figure out. There's no reward for pride. There's no reward for admitting, hey, I may be looking at the wrong thing. I may not know something. So what me and one of my colleagues, Ramsey, motto is permanent beginner's mind. You know, like, I don't care if I know, I write C and C++, I know what memcopy does. I may still look at the spec document sometimes just to validate that nothing's changed, I still understand it. So being able to admit when you're out of your depth or you don't understand application as intimately as another engineer who's been working on this application for 5 to 10 years, that's a really key process. Being able to know what to ask, being able to really get out what the security concerns that the developers have, because they write code, they have security concerns. Being able to communicate when you're doing a scoping call and they say, so you can do this in a week, being able to communicate, no, that's not exactly what happens. Being able to communicate the benefits of not doing a full black box review. Simple example of that would be a hacker or a malicious actor, or however you want to refer to someone who's doing this not necessarily for good purposes. They have a year, 2 years, 3 years to find a vulnerability, right? I have 4 to 6 weeks. doing a full black box approach to an application, I'm not going to see every issue. It's not possible. I'd love to say, you know, I can find it all. I can't. So when I'm doing a gray box review, I'll look for certain issues or certain side effects or certain symptoms that may indicate a deeper problem, and then I'll go into the code. So being able to communicate that example and say black box really isn't going to give you the coverage that you want. Communication when you find a critical vulnerability. How do you describe why it's critical? And here's going to push back. No one likes it. Let's say you wrote a coding assignment and you turn it in and your professor says it sucks, you get an F. No one likes saying that. And cybersecurity, for example, when you find a critical vulnerability, sometimes people lose their jobs because you found that. It's people get defensive, people get argumentative, people say this is by design. You don't know what you're talking about. We've accounted for this. It can get very, very aggressive. So emphasizing, you know, we're not reporting this publicly, emphasizing that we're on your side. We just want to help secure the application. Trying to work through mitigation. Maybe the mitigation is going to take 6 or 8 weeks. So trying to figure out a case where there's some fixes we can do to make it harder to exploit in the meantime. That type of communication is key because no one likes having the baby called up late. No one likes that conversation at all.
I think you've hit on some really important skills. I want to circle back. You talked about having a beginner's mind. Mm-hmm. And the idea that if you really are out of your element, admit it and go and find the help you need. I look at studies of new hires at Microsoft. There was a kind of a landmark study in the early 2000s about this. And the number one problem observed with new hires is that they're too stubborn, that they get, when they're stuck, they don't admit they're stuck and they just spin their wheels and waste a lot of time. So that seems to be really important in cybersecurity as well, to be able to admit you're stuck and reach out.
Absolutely. And sometimes you're in a rabbit hole. You believe there's something here so much that you spend 3 or 4 days hitting something, and there might be something there, and maybe we just don't have the time to exploit it, or maybe there's nothing there. So knowing when to tell someone, hey, I'm stuck in a rabbit hole, you need to pull me out, or knowing when you've hit your boundary of time. That it's, you know, no one's going to get upset for you asking questions. People are going to get upset when you wasted a bunch of money and a bunch of time and not done what you were supposed to do.
Right. The other thing that stood out to me as you were talking is the sensitive nature of what you're doing. You know, people have invested a lot of hours in making an application secure, and when you find a vulnerability, you know, they're going to get defensive or feel vulnerable themselves, you know, maybe subject to attack. And so you suggest that really emphasizing that you're on their side, that we're a team, that, you know, it's okay to, if there's vulnerabilities that are going to happen. That's really important. So that's really kind of an interpersonal skill that you have to bring to bear. So do you have any, you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So I want to emphasize that typically when we're on an engagement, the company's hired us, right? Developers traditionally understand what we're doing and they try not to get defensive. But there are times where people do get defensive. I have been on calls where people have gotten very heated about something that was found. So the key is you really need to understand the impact of what you're saying. So let's say you are storing access, you're storing an access token in plain text in, let's say on Android, an SD card. Okay, well, that's externally accessible. That's a terrible design, right? Probably not. Don't tell someone like this is stupid. Don't say that. It might really be a terrible design. Probably best not to say that.
What would you say?
You would say, you know, during testing, we observed that there was a access token that was in an SD card. Upon, you know, leveraging Burp Suite and sending this access token, we were able to retrieve account data, which indicates that this access token is valid. Doing basic support to code on this, so JSON Web Token, you're able to see that the validity is 1 week. So anyone with access to this would have a valid access token for a week. Let's say there's no session. Now that's even worse because now you can use the access token whenever. Doesn't matter if they log out or not. So you would define that type of stuff. You would say from an SD card, it's accessible by anyone. So, I could take your Android phone, I could plug it in, I could get that value. Let's say it's for a bank account system or something like that. That's a pretty big deal. So you would kind of define that risk. What the issue is, why is it an issue? What would you recommend instead of doing it that way? That's how you handle it. Yeah, you don't say terrible design, you don't say anything of that sort. When you write about it, you describe your observations, you describe the risk, you really don't describe anything. You try not to describe anything negative. If someone gets heated on call and it's really offensive and says by design stuff, you say that's, we're not here to analyze your design, or not, well, we are there to analyze your design. We don't sit there and we're not like, hey, we're not there to tell you how to work your application stuff. The current way that this application works, the risk that we see is this and this. Now, if you don't want to fix that or you don't see that as a risk, that's totally fine. And we've had clients not fix things, and we've had clients not fix things and they get exploited later. We've had clients not fix things, they get exploited later, and then bug bounties get paid on things that get exploited later. So the key is to really describe the risk. The key is to emphasize we're not there to tell them to do something or not. We're there to document the risk. That's it. And we're there to help them fix it if they want us to help them fix it or to describe mitigations.
So I want to step back just one more step, and you're talking about an engagement.
Yeah.
That's 4 to 6 weeks. It sounds to me kind of like a tax audit, but it's for security issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume that the deliverable at the end is some sort of white paper or report.
Yep.
That describes the vulnerabilities and makes recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely written communication skills are going to be important with that. So does your company? I also think of security being done in like a command center, like as you're they're monitoring web logs, and is that involved? Are you at all involved in that kind of moment-to-moment monitoring of security threats?
So we don't traditionally do so what you're talking about is red blue teaming, kind of like, so in the case of,
I don't know the term. What is red blue teaming?
So blue teaming is a defensive nature. Red teaming is an offensive nature. So red and blue teams will commonly do attack simulation where the blue team's trying to monitor everything that you're doing and the red team's trying to break in.
Okay.
So so have we done red teaming type engagements in the past where we'll have someone monitoring everything and we will try to break in? Yes. Is it conducive to a security review? In my opinion, if it's an application that has not been reviewed in the past, probably not. And the reason is I'm going to spend time trying to obfuscate things. I'm going to spend time being very careful on how to send things. Maybe I know, okay, in the case of red teaming and blue teaming, you'd use OSINT. Maybe I know that you rotate at midnight and someone who's not knowledgeable is coming on. So I'm going to send my payload at midnight. I'm going to send a few payloads prior to that just because I know someone's going to get hooked up in the logs. Maybe I know what that person is doing. So there's things like that you do on a red team and blue team engagement that you don't do in a traditional penetration testing engagement. But we have done those things in the past. As far as the deliverables go, yes, there is a long report at the end that we deliver. Traditionally, the report's between 30 to 150 pages, somewhere in there. Sounds like a lot, but it just depends on the number of findings. If I find 50 different things, well, that's 50, 60, 70 pages right there of just vulnerabilities. But it will always have like an evaluation of the application, what we looked for, documenting how we did testing, what we found, what we didn't get to, what we did look for, why we didn't see anything. Because at the end of the day, if we miss something, that's going to come back. So really documenting things is key. So that will be in the report. And then we also traditionally do a readout, which is where we have a final presentation, we'll have a call, and number of people can be on it, anywhere from program managers and just developers, maybe just developers, all the way up to C-suite executives are saying right in, listening to everything you did and everything you found. So, and for those, it can be very nerve-wracking because you don't know what types of questions you're going to get asked, and you have to be prepared to answer anything. But that, yeah, those are the traditional deliverables.
So I'm just trying to understand the models in cybersecurity for addressing potential security threats. You've got these kind of engagements that are like audits.
Mm-hmm.
And then is there a set of company employees kind of designated to monitor web logs and deal with threats as they come in? Or is that considered to be too late at that point? I mean, is that a form of cybersecurity professional as well?
Yeah, I mean, so security engineer is a all-encompassing term. So there are security engineers that literally just do IT configurations. There are security engineers who just monitor logs. There are security engineers who do hacking. There are security engineers who just run tools. So there are people who will just monitor logs. There are people who will track vulnerabilities and make sure they get fixed. That's a per company. Some companies have the infrastructure to handle vulnerability tracking. Some companies may not. It will just go into some database and it'll get addressed. It won't get addressed.
Is the philosophy in the industry then that you really want to get the biggest vulnerabilities out in these audits, these engagements? Because by the time you get to an active threat in the logs, there's not a whole lot you can do.
So
or are there like super expert log monitors who can, like, you know, on the turn of a dime, like fix a vulnerability?
So okay. So obviously on an engagement, we want to get the highest severity vulnerabilities right off the cuff. Can we always do that? Not necessarily. Security is an iterative process. So maybe we initially find a bunch of low-hanging fruit, medium-sized stuff. They go and fix that, and then we start hitting the application for more targeted things. As far as people that are monitoring logs for compromise, there are indicators of compromise, IOC, that may indicate that users or your application has been compromised. Typically, though, it's very hard when we identify a critical vulnerability for a company to go back and figure out everything about that. Sometimes that's because maybe this vulnerability has existed for years and no one's identified it. Sometimes it's because maybe there was insufficient logging, which would be a finding in and of itself to say, hey, you weren't logging this. Maybe there was a log pollution vector, so all those logs actually got destroyed or corrupted anyway. So there are people who can identify vulnerabilities from logs and can identify things with an exploit. Depending on the nature of the application, it may be as easy as just flipping a switch to fix the issue. It may be as complicated as requiring everyone to install a brand new update, or maybe forcibly shutting down people's accounts and having them reset their passwords and stuff. It could be any, depending on the nature.
You might have to write a patch.
Yeah. So
that's going to take some time.
Yeah. You know, we've definitely found things that are like critical and they get a patch out that day. Like, for example, if you report cross-site scripting, it's going to get fixed. That's a critical vulnerability for a lot of companies. People will have engineers on it the moment you report it, they'll be fixed overnight. So yeah, but patches traditionally take time. So typically what the engineers will do is they'll issue a patch really quickly just to stop it, whether or not that's just turning off the functionality that exploits that or anything, and then they'll get into fixing it later.
So what are some of the tools you use during your engagements to help you identify vulnerabilities?
So one of the tools I mentioned, Burp Suite, that's the classic by Portswigger. It's called Burp Suite. It's an intercepting proxy, so it enables man in the middle. Effectively, you take a root cert, you install that on your computer or web browser. I mean, if you're using Firefox, you can throw in Firefox as a certificate manager and use proxy, and you proxy the traffic through Burp Suite. That enables us to read all the network logs and intercept requests, modify requests, and then send requests from there. So that can enable anything from client-side, server-side validation to identifying SSRF, CSRF. Maybe they're doing client-side validation, so we can get cross-site scripting by sending a request directly to the server, and then from there it gets popped back up. That would be a stored cross-site scripting vulnerability. So that's Burp Suite's like the key thing to use. From there, depending on the nature, like for iOS, Proxyman is really useful, or macOS application. It is also a proxy. It's just a little bit easier to use and to set up. There's things like SemGrep, which is a tool that it's a stack analysis tool that profiles a code base using an abstract form of a AST, an abstract syntax tree, to identify issues. The problem with those types of tools is there's a lot of false positives. So if I run SemGrep on an application and it identifies 30,000 vulnerabilities, now I have to debate, do I actually go through every single one of them and identify if it is a vulnerability or if it isn't? Do I just report it and say, hey, you guys maybe want to look at this or employ some type of tools? Do I just ignore all the issues? That's an issue with stack analysis tools. There is things like Sneak, which identifies vulnerable dependencies. So dependencies or vulnerable dependencies. So that's an issue with anything supply chains or anything of that sort. So that's good to use. MobSF does application inspection. It can do iOS IPAs and Android APKs and just identify vulnerabilities with that. As far as like Visual Studio, obviously, or Xcode or Android Studio, using emulators if you're doing an Android application, using simulators if you're doing a iOS application. Nessus for network scanning, Nmap, understanding how to use Nmap, common files, common configurations. Yeah, those are some of the tools. Obviously, that's just a very small list. There's hundreds of cybersecurity tools. It just depends on what you're using and what you're going for, the tech stack, and you'll go from there to identify things.
So some of the folks in the audience here are looking to get into cybersecurity as a profession. What can you tell them about the interview process, what questions you ask? Should they get skills in those tools that you talked about? Would that be kind of a feather in their cap to get in? So could you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So for Cybersecurity, I do all the interviews. So the first person you're going to talk to is me, and the interview will be standard questions like, hey, give me a brief overview of your resume, or the classic, tell me about a time when you had to work to solve a difficult problem. How did you solve it? Or tell me about the hardest problem you faced in school or work and how did you solve it? So standard questions will do like 20 or 30 minutes on that. And then we'll go into technical questions, and that takes anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, just depending on, do you know the answers right off the bat? Are you, I don't mean for this to sound rude, but are you like word vomiting or just trying to say every single thing about something? For cross-site scripting, are you just saying, I think cross-site scripting is a script execution in the context of this browser. And I mean, you need to like validate things and like look at things and take a look at things and analyze things. And I've had people just give very long-winded answers trying to cover every single possible answer, right? So if you're doing that, the interview takes a lot longer. I've had interviews go over 2 hours.
Is that good when they do that? Or is that?
So it depends. If you're saying things that are related to the answer, and maybe I ask you about cross-site scripting, you say, hey, I know there's input validation, output sanitization, web application firewall. And actually, I was looking at one application one time and I was finding this cross-site scripting vulnerability. Maybe it just goes because they really want to talk about it and show their enthusiasm. That's great. I love to see that, because let's say that we're going to hire you. You're not going to run an engagement for 3 years, at least 3 to 5 years minimum, because you're going to be learning how we do things. You're going to be learning the report format, how to speak to people, how to do applications. At some point, you're going to get your own application, and you're going to have to kind of roll with that. So
You mean to test?
yeah,
So you have like a set of sample apps that you for training purposes?
so no, but we'll give you, so for example, on my team, so I co-manage a team with Ramsey, who is another engineer. Ramsey is the former CISO of MySpace. So back in the day when MySpace existed. So we have a new person on our team, right? So we'll have them review certain functionalities of applications that we've reviewed and be like, hey, see if you can identify issues with this code base. Maybe there's a directory that we've already looked at. So we feel like we've found most of the issues. So we'll say, hey, take a look at that, see if you can identify things too. We won't tell them what we've seen, just to identify, see if they're finding things. Maybe if they're not finding things, we'll say, hey, so, look at this file, for example, look at this section of code. Do you see anything in there that may be an issue? We do have sample applications that are like damn vulnerable web app. That's a really DBWA, terrible example, but there are sample applications like that you can use. CourseWigger, Web Security Academy has labs. So maybe we'll say, hey, look at this lab and see if you can solve it. So there are sample applications, but we don't have sample applications that we've written to be like, hey, go for that. So, I mean, obviously you guys can see I ramble a lot, so my interview process will probably take a long time too. Expressing enthusiasm, showing enthusiasm, getting correct answers. That's great. I really don't care how many answers you get correct though. I care about how you think about things. So,
So making your thought process publicly available.
yeah, so maybe here's a question that I've asked people in the past. I'll give you this really hard one because a lot of people don't get this. So in AES CBC mode, so CyPHER blockchaining mode, there is a coding power called encrypt the macro, encrypt and hack. So effectively, you're going to have plain text, you're going to convert that to ciphertext, and you're going to have a message authentication. So you're going to have something that validates that ciphertext has not been changed. When I'm decrypting it, does it matter in what order I do things? That's to say, can I split the ciphertext and the map, do things with the ciphertext, as long as I validate that the hash of the ciphertext matches? If I validate and it doesn't match, I clean up everything, get rid of everything. So there should be no information disclosure vector or anything of that sort. Does that matter as long as I validate it? Someone want to take a guess? It does. So someone said no. So it doesn't matter as long as I validate, right? That's what someone said?
That's what I heard.
So that would be entirely wrong. So it's terrible. No, I'm just kidding. This is a very hard topic. People who've been doing this for 20 years still make this mistake. So in ASCC mode, there's a vulnerability. And this, well, that's what you love to hear, right? And encryption protocol, there's a vulnerability, but there's not really a vulnerability, but there is this vulnerability if you do it in a wrong fashion. So upon decrypting, the moment you touch that ciphertext, the moment you touch it, you're revealing information, you're revealing timing data. I can use that timing data. So the attack vector here is called a chosen ciphertext attack. So effectively, if you're not validating the hash before you touch it, every bit of the ciphertext I get correct, I get more information about what you're doing. So effectively, I can derive your ciphertext. I can actually derive this information. I can figure out I can figure out what you're trying to decrypt and effectively decrypt it. So a classic example of that is in PKCS 1B15, there's Blankenbacher's attack. And that enables full decryption through padding information. So knowing timing vectors, so rewind for a second. that's a hard question, right? And I phrase it, and I'm very evil about the way that I phrase it. I say, hey, but you checked it. No, like we're cleaning up everything that's very, are you sure? And a lot of times people want to answer from an optimization perspective. Well, it always makes sense to validate before, right? But I always say like, no, that's not what I'm going for. I don't really care about optimization. This thing runs super fast. Let's not even worry about that. Let's just focus on this section. Or on this steps. Like I want you to get your rationale. So a lot of times people will say things like, well, I know AES supersedes XORs, and I'm like, I don't care about the XORing, but you're right, there are XOR operations. And people try to reason through, does it really matter, does it not? And you don't really see the timing vector. I care about how people think. I care about, are people like, well, hash is for integrity, so obviously you need to validate the integrity of the ciphertext, but you're validating it at the end. So walking through that thought process, saying, well, I guess if you validate at the beginning, you're preventing something. So you're preventing the ciphertext from being decrypted. So I guess if someone passed in random ciphertexts that weren't correct, you would be like describing that, talking about that, reasoning through that. That I like a lot more than someone saying, I don't know. That I don't really like, I don't know. I like someone to work with. If you just said timing vector, that's it. Okay, okay, you've gotten the correct answer, but now I'm gonna go even deeper and ask you exactly what the issue is. I'll show you a code snippet and say, how would I exploit this? So being able to walk through things, that's key.
Do you have any advice for preparing for such an interview?
Good luck. No, so I say that jokingly. So honestly, the key with my interviews, and I really mean this, I have had people get most of the questions wrong, but describe their thought process for every single one of them. And I'm like, okay, so I know you know the tech. I know you're just getting confused on certain things. Maybe you're not flipping that evil bit. Maybe you're not seeing the attacker side of it, but you're understanding everything. So all I have to do is flip your evil bit, and the moment I do that, you're going to understand this issue. So that's what we call it.
The evil bit.
The evil bit, yes, flipping the evil bit. That is our term for it. So being able to reason through questions, being able to ask questions, maybe you don't know, I'm showing you a sample of code and you don't know what a certain API does, ask. I don't care, you would Google it in real life if you didn't know. So don't hold stake on your pride and say, oh, I got this, I'm figuring it out. Say something like, hey, I'll just give you all my questions. Yeah, I'm just giving you all my questions right now. Actually, no, I could show you a interview question, but
We've got about 10 minutes left.
I know.
And I want to give some time for the audience to ask questions.
Yeah, so being able to ask questions, being able to say, hey, I'm not sure, could you give me a little bit more information about this? Being concise with your answers, in the case of cross-site scripting, get the most important bits out first, because when you're starting to ramble about a lot of things and then you say input validation at the very end, I may not hear input validation anymore. I may just have written down all the stuff that you said previously. That's kind of the key thing. You're not going to know everything. Interviewers know you're not going to know everything. I don't know everything. You may answer a question, I may not. I've had people answer questions, I'm like, I never even thought about that. Like, that's totally valid, never even crossed my mind. So being able to rationalize, I guess, what you're trying to say and what you're trying to describe, that's the key. But yeah, I mean, just practice lots of interviews, it will help. It will help you understand things, it will help you answer things. Also, please send a thank you after the interview. I've interviewed probably over 150 people. I've gotten 5 thank yous or 6 thank yous. And I think 5 out of 6 of those we hired. So
Good
it,
advice.
it
Yeah.
goes a long way to saying, hey, I really appreciate the time.
I think what's striking in what you said is, yeah, the technical knowledge is important, but the ability to communicate your thought process is equally important.
Yes.
So there we have this balance of what we call soft skills and technical skills as essential to succeeding in the discipline, which is true really of all engineering disciplines.
100%. Like explain your thought process is really important.
And that, as you say, that comes through practice, doing practice interviews, as painful as that sounds.
Yeah. Asking why, asking, being with your friends and doing so interviews and really trying to get deep at the answer, not just answering one thing only. Thinking about things in other contexts, cross-site scripting, input validation versus output sanitization. Okay, which one's more important? Is input validation more important or is output sanitization more important? Anyone have an answer? Input validation, output sanitization. Okay, output sanitization is more important. The reason is that if you tell me your input validation is absolutely perfect, all you've done is shifted the attack focus. I'm not going to attack your application anymore. I know your input validation is super strong. I'm going to attack the database and get a cross-site scripting vector in there. When that renders onto the page, it's going to execute. So actually stating all input or all output, that's going to prevent cross-site scripting. Input validation only goes so far. So being able to rationalize that stuff, being able to ask why is one more important than the other, doing that with your friends, that helps when you get interviewed and when you get asked questions.
But, Slater, you've covered everything that I wanted to talk about, but probably not everything our audience wants to talk about. So I'm going to open it up to our audience for questions. What do you have for Slater?
So the company basically does like large long-term projects, testing company security with permission. Have you ever done like the unsolicited kind of bug bounty kind of stuff?
So from our company's perspective, it would be wrong. So some of the companies I've mentioned, right, that we work for, it would be wrong if I found a bug and was like, hey, pay me for this vulnerability, even though we work directly with the company, right? If I found something, I would just send it to one of the security engineers at the company that I know and say, hey, you may want to take a look at this. For other companies, we've had people do bug bounty stuff in the past. Different companies pay different amounts for it. Typically in a consulting arrangement, as long as we're not working with that company, it's less frowned upon. And I just want to say, like, I'm completely pro bug bounty. If it's a company we have a good working relationship with and we work a lot with or something of that sort, it's probably best that you don't do that. Also, then you have to wonder, okay, did you know this was an issue during the engagement and you just waited 6 months after and then reported it? So that type of stuff.
On a day-to-day basis, percentage-wise, how many of the tasks you do would you say are individual, and how many of the tasks you do would be done directly in a group? And then based on that, how would you weight the value of so-called like soft skills that determine how effective someone is at working in a group? For new hires.
Yeah, so we never do one person review something. Where like you're on the project by yourself, no one else. Good luck. I have no knowledge of it. Give me the report when you're done. We don't do that. So you're always going to be working in a group of some sort. As far as skills, maybe so let's say there's 3 people on engagement. I might say, hey, I'm going to focus on looking at cryptographic primitives. I'm going to be looking for, are they using like SHA-128, for example, or MD5? If they are they using it in a vulnerable manner? Does it reveal information? So I might say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take that. I'm going to spend a day or two. You guys should look at some other things. That I would say is probably like 20% or so, just because we don't have time for 3 people to go through every single possible thing. But we always are working in the group in this case that we don't know everything. Maybe someone else knows something. I might say, hey, can you hop on a call, walk through this code segment with me? I think there's something here. This is my understanding. I just want to see if you have a different understanding about what I'm looking at. And maybe they'll say, hey, let's go up one level higher in the call stack and take a look here, something of that sort. Maybe I didn't think about that. So 80% teamwork, I would say, something like that. 20% independent. Different teams have different, in our company have different working styles, but that's what I would say for like my team. Yeah.
I was just wondering, what are some of the most common mistakes or I guess I shouldn't say mistakes, common vulnerabilities that you see in companies?
Hey, I have a job here. I'm not telling you that.
Uh,
Just kidding. You don't really see cross-site scripting anymore. Using frameworks like Angular and React stringifies everything. So there are mitigations in place. So in the case of like a progressive web application, really the only way to gain cross-site scripting is someone using JSON or HTML in the case of React, or combining different payloads.
Using the inner HTML.
Yeah, or someone or later combining it. So you add different parts. You add different parts of the payload to different parts of the application, hope it renders somewhere else. So you don't really see cross-site scripting. You do see things like vulnerable dependence. You do see things like MD5 use. You do see things like insecure deserialization vectors. So in the case of Newton soft, having the application infer the data type can lead to a vulnerability through insecure deserialization. Developer assumptions like zip slips, for example. So a zip slip is directory traversal. You don't validate what's inside the zip file. So effectively, when you extract from the zip file, it can overwrite a file outside of the working directory or outside of the directory where it's expected to extract. I would say those are common types of vulnerabilities. Typically nowadays you see HTTPS or you see SSL/TLS for everything. So you don't really have that issue. Data storage, so storing access tokens and logs or things like that, that stuff does happen. Typically it was for debugging or something like that, and that person just forgot to remove it. So it wasn't malicious or anything of that sort. Yeah.
So I know you guys mentioned that like one, well, I guess it just falls into it's like not asking for help. On the like other end of that is not like that, but like you go like supervisor as soon as they run into engagement. So like when you find is like the down like in the right out of that person solve it before like or
That's a great question. It's a really hard question to answer. So let's say I'm working on an engagement for company X. I probably don't want to message company X's developers a lot, being like, hey, what does this block of code do? Hey, what does this API do? Hey, where do I find this? Probably don't want to do that. I'm wasting the developer's time. What I would say is, depending on what you're looking at, if you're looking at a block of code and you're spending 10 minutes looking at 20 lines of code and you can't figure it out, but you feel like there's something there, then I would say you're probably at that point should shoot someone a message and be like, hey, just have a question really quickly, and not company X. You would shoot like me a message, right? If you're on my team, and be like, hey, can you just look at this? I just want to sanity check something really quickly. It depends on the application. It depends on what you're looking at. You kind of, I hate to say you kind of figure it out, but you do kind of figure it out as you're working in the team. Initially, when you start, we expect you to ask a lot more questions. So there might be an 8-hour working session where you might say, hey, I don't know about this. Can you look at it a little bit more?
And I would just say, as a response to that, if you are not using the same tools that the person you're asking the question has access to, you should get access to those tools so that you can answer your own questions. So for example, the debugger, like if you're not using a debugger, but you're asking questions, and so essentially you're making the person you're asking questions use the debugger, that's probably not a good use of their time because you could have answered your own questions. So make sure you have the right tools before I think that's
a key thing too. If I can do every single thing that you're possibly doing, that's a red flag right there. Like you really want to have tried some things.
Yeah, I think we're out of time.
Cool. This has been great. I hate to cut it off, but these two will be here